Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hey everyone, Jody here. You know, it's generally not a good sign when I have to come in with one of these messages before our episode. It usually means that, something not esoteric and something not from history is going on in the world. We decided to hold off on publishing this episode at our normal time. We'd recorded it in advance, but given what is going on in DC this week, it just didn't feel right to put it out the very day after. We also decided not to do a special episode because while there are certainly moments where history can give you context for what you are seeing, one, we don't know exactly what we're witnessing just yet in our politics. Everything is changing really fast and everything feels on the table, feels possible. And 2, sometimes you kind of just have to pay attention, full attention to the history being made right in front of you. Anyway, that is a very long, very fraught way to introduce an episode about George Bush vomiting in the lap of the Japanese prime minister. But hey, that is the episode that is on the calendar. That is the episode we are bringing you now. Maybe it will give you a bit of a distraction or perspective or whatever. Maybe it will serve as a reminder that we will get back to a world in which stuff like this counts as the political news of the day. But on behalf of everyone on the show, hope you're holding up out there. Be in touch, and here we go. Hello, and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Aragon. This day, January 8th, 1992, at about 8:20 p.m. Japan time. Well, some leads, they just write themselves. While attending a banquet hosted by the Prime Minister of Japan, Kiichi Miyazawa, U.S. President George H.W. Bush vomited in Mr. Miyazawa's lap, and then he fainted. So, Nicole Hemmer, we have to make this show about 15 minutes long. We are about 45 seconds in, so we have about 14 minutes or so of vomit content. We're on the clock.
I believe in us.
We can pull it off.
Yeah,
you believe in us?
I do.
Okay. That voice, of course, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
All right. George H.W. Bush. He's attending a state dinner. He vomits in the Japanese prime minister's lap. What are the particulars of the case? And then I promise we will get to some actual interesting context to this.
Well, the case in and of itself is fascinating. There's video of this event. It is pretty gross. I think we should link to it so people can watch if they would like. There are also a lot of SNL skits about it. It becomes one of the defining moments, I would say, of the Bush administration. Look, he had gastroenteritis and he vomited and he fainted on the Prime Minister of Japan. He did it between the second and the third course. The second course was raw salmon with caviar, an enjoyable dish to revisit. And the third was grilled beef with peppery sauce. I'm not sure he ever got to that one.
Yeah. The first course, red flag. Second course, even redder flag.
No kidding.
I mean, yeah. So one of those things in retrospect, you look at it. I also really love the idea of you doing the breakdown of this, like Kevin Costner and JFK, like back and to the left, back and to the left. But yes, but there is video out there of this moment, and you can see exactly what happens. He's sitting next to the prime minister. He leans over, he barfs, and then he sort of like falls off his chair, and everyone rushes to his aid.
One thing that I would say about that video is that it is kind of a scary moment because he vomits, he passes out, and then he's just kind of down for the count. You see, not to continue with the Kevin Costner references, but you see Barbara Bush sort of start to climb over the prime minister in order to get to her husband in a very Zapruder-esque way from the Kennedy days. You see the Secret Service sort of climbing over the table to get to him. And it takes him, a few minutes to get back into the game. So it is this moment where now that we know he was just sick with the stomach flu, it's no big deal. But at the moment, it did look like it could be something much more serious.
Yes. And, I will say that, I think if we think of this as we'll get into whether this is a gaffe or what exactly this counts as. But, the Bushes did play it off relatively well. It was scary in the moment. But then apparently there were reports that he quipped to his doctor, just roll me under the table until the dinner's over. And then they made a crack about it during a press conference the next day. A lot of that, I think, because it wasn't super, super serious. But not to get too semiotic here, but I do think that this ends up playing not as bad as it could, and maybe even kind of maybe good, because it has this quality, like you said, of it is a very scary moment, but then it ends up not being scary. You see this with videos that go viral now or whatever. It's there is actually still an empathy threshold that if something passes where it's oh, this person might really be in trouble, people don't necessarily jump on it as much as they would if someone did something that was just sort of embarrassing. And so I think this benefited a little from that, real fear, but then it also benefited from being silly and just people have had the flu and people get stomach poisoning, and so it happens. And especially when you think of it in the context of some of the other gaffes that Bush had during that same trip, it's really interesting to start to think about does a moment like this hurt politically? Does it how does it affect someone's image, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of those moments, this was a trip to Australia and up into Asia. And in Australia, he had done that very familiar V for Victory sign, something that he did a lot in the wake of the Persian Gulf War. But of course, in Australia, that's an obscene gesture. And that is much more one of those classic gaffes where somebody's cultural ignorance turns it into this laughable moment that's their fault, where the stomach flu, it's not really anyone's fault. Although I do think we can talk about this in a bit. I think it does have some political consequences for him, but it's very different than accidentally flipping off the Australian people.
Yes, I think that's right. And so you have things that are actual gaffes. On that same trip, he also praised the Singaporean prime minister, who was in the middle of a really serious strongman crackdown, including outlawing the sale of chewing gum. And so, again, these overseas trips are often very, very fraught, and they lead to gaffes and also faux pas and diplomatic mistakes. And so when you put this moment in the context of that, I think it casts it in an interesting light. So let's talk about how this affected his image and whether it had long-term effect. I was surprised a little at the very beginning to hear you say that you really felt like it did affect his image or his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to put too much weight on any one incident, particularly an incident like this, but it's important to remember that in the early 1990s, there was this kind of nativist and economic fear of a rising Japan, that the Japanese people were smarter, they were more efficient, they were making better products, they were flooding the U.S. market with goods, and that American manufacturing just couldn't keep up. And so this fear of Japan and this sort of symbol of American weakness in the face of Japan,
right,
which is what this comes to represent. Somebody like Pat Buchanan, who at the time is running against George H.W. Bush, attacks him pretty hard on things like the rising Japan, on China. And so, would Buchanan still have attacked him in that way? Of course he would. He was already attacking him.
Yeah.
But this idea that a president looks weak against a competing nation, that is a moment that can be difficult and have a lasting impact when you're being painted as weak. And that was the big charge. So it reinforces the big charge against Bush.
That's interesting. Right. So you don't have people, explicitly saying, oh, he threw up in the prime minister's lap, look how weak he is. But when they sort of refer to that overall weakness, he can't stand up to Japan. This is in back of mind. I guess you could call that a dog whistle or something. We've moved past the days of that, right? Of that subtle sort of second order attack, right? Because right now, if this happened, you just have people straight up making fun of him for exactly that, as opposed to doing the sort of more nuanced, bigger themed thing that you're describing.
Yeah. And we should say he was made fun of a lot for this.
But by SNL and
right.
that kind of thing, right?
Right. It was less so in politics. And in part, he was made fun of it less in political circles because, there were some concerns about his health. Obviously, this is just the stomach flu, but he had had this incident about a year earlier where he had atrial fibrillation, which is just a rapid heart rate, but it had put him in the hospital, and it had people concerned about, this kind of old president. He'd been around for a really long time. He was starting to show his age. And so there was this way that Buchanan used it against him, but also Clinton uses it against him in 92, that Bush is just old and tired and we're ready for the new generation that Clinton claimed to represent.
Totally. And this is right when the election is starting to heat up and Clinton and other Democrats are trying to draw those lines. Bush does get questions about exactly what you described right after this happens. There's this press conference where a reporter asks him, "You've now had 2 semi-public health episodes." He, I think, responds pretty deftly. He's like, "Do you think only old people and only Republicans get the flu? Democrats get the flu too. So I wouldn't worry about this." But again, like we've discussed on this show, it's like when you have a moment that reinforces a bigger existing theme, that's when it sticks. Even if it doesn't stick as a specific, it just sort of adds to this larger story. There's also this interesting media context here because there is video, and I think that maybe 10 years earlier, maybe certainly 20 years earlier, there's a chance that there wouldn't be video of this moment. Obviously, cable news is up and running and this gets beamed, but it is happening sort of in Japan, but it gets beamed back to the United States. So it becomes this scandal immediately in a way that I think reflects some of the kind of changing media landscape of 1992.
Yeah, this becomes a news story, but what's so interesting is because you now have 24-hour news, which is not something that you had before, you have people trying to insert themselves in the story. So there's this man who starts calling around to CNN down in Atlanta and says, "The president has died. I'm the president's doctor, and the president died." And this gets typed into the news feed for both CNN and Headline News, which is its little companion network. And the anchor starts to say on air, "We have some sad news. The president," and then you hear a producer off on the side being like, no, because they realize that it's not verified. But he came this close to actually saying that Bush had died because there's not the same kind of process yet for this kind of breaking news on 24-hour television.
Yeah, there's all sorts of these examples in like the 90s of taking advantage of that new media environment. Was this like a Howard Stern thing? Do you have any idea?
Like a Baba Booey?
My assumption is it's always some sort of Howard Stern is at the heart of all of this. For instance, during the OJ chase, there's a moment where it ends up being a Howard Stern affiliated person, but someone calls in and basically is on CNN for like 5-6 minutes basically making up stuff. So yeah, you see those perils now. It hasn't fully changed, I would say. Like cable news is still pretty subject to like dicey information in the rush to fill 24 hours a day with news.
Indeed they are. Well, this guy, his name was James Edward Smith. He had some mental health issues and would actually end up hospitalized shortly after this. But so he wasn't quite a Baba Booey guy, but he did demonstrate the perils of this kind of breaking news.
So as we come to an end, I will throw in one more thing about this, which is there is reportedly a phrase in Japan now, a colloquial phrase, bushushuru or bushuru, where we've seen different reports, but it basically roughly translates to pulling a bush, which is a slang term for vomiting, I guess, embarrassingly or something. I don't know.
I think that gets us up to our vomit quota, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So if we have any listeners from Japan and can confirm exactly what bushuru means, or whether that's like totally passé 90s slang and there's now something else that has replaced it, please do let us know. But look, we've kind of done it. We've kind of filled our 15 minutes with Bush vomiting into the lap of the prime minister talk. But maybe as we wrap up, I am interested in whether there are other moments that relate to this in that sort of category of like, embarrassing but relatively harmless presidential gaffes, because it is really fascinating to me kind of what ends up counting as a gaffe, what's a faux pas, what's a diplomatic mistake. There's a spectrum there.
There is. I'm not going to pick on Carter because I feel like we've given him his due on his gaffes. But one that comes to mind is Gerald Ford when he was on the campaign trail in 1976 eating a tamale without realizing that you needed to take the husk off. So he just like chows down into it. I think that's one of those things where it's like, it's definitely a gaffe. And it's one that could underscore a point that maybe he wasn't super familiar with the Latino constituency he was trying to appeal to.
Yeah. I think even if you're encountering a tamale for the first time, like that banana husk if you're holding that thing, you're not going to bite your way through that. You should just
That is not
you know?
digestible material.
Yeah. That's not about familiarity with Latino cuisine. That's just about like unfamiliarity with the basic tensile strength of the food that you put into your mouth. But that also brings up, like there's the de Blasio eating pizza with a knife and a fork. And every few years, someone eats pizza with a knife and a fork, especially when they're in New York City. And it's just like, just don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah, there's a real challenge anytime a politician encounters food, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially with a camera around.
Including one that I want to bring up when they try and spell food. So, right, there's that Dan Quayle faux pas or mistake. He's like at an elementary school and helping kids spell, and he encounters the word potato, and he spells it with an E at the end. Is that right?
It's close to right. So it was a spelling bee, which makes it even worse because he dinged the kid who spelled it P-A-T-A-T-O.
Oh, he dinged the kid and said, "Oh, you got it wrong. There's an E at the end of potato." And that that really cemented Dan Quayle is not the sharpest tool in the shed narrative.
Yes, it was a reputation he'd been burnishing for a while, but he really sealed the deal with that one.
It's pretty brutal.
Okay. Can I just spell potato one more time? Because I'm not entirely sure that when I took a run at it that I got it in the right order. P-O-T-A-T-O.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, okay. P-O-T-A.
As soon as I said it, I was like, where did I put that A? I know it's there somewhere.
I will say for the rest of my life, thanks to Dan Quayle, I have been very cautious around the word potato.
As you should be. It can trip up even the second most powerful person in the country.
That's right. All right. We're going to leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media at This Day Pod. We're posting a bunch of stuff on Twitter and Instagram every day. We're posting about moments, big and small, stuff that we can't get to on the show. So if you want more of a steady stream of esoteric political history, follow us Instagram and Twitter at This Day Pod. You can email us with any questions or comments about the show, thisdaypod@gmail.com. There is also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.